Okay, so now we are continuing on in the book of Joshua. The last few weeks we've gone all the way through chapter 4. A little quick reference. Where are we right now in Joshua? Where are the Israelites right now? Daniel, where are we?
Across the river.
Across the river, very good.
Grandma's house.
You owe Bruce a thank you for a lifeline there. Okay? The Israelites have crossed over the River Jordan, and we're going to find out that they were in plain sight of everyone. In everyone. So, with that, what I'd like to do is I would like to go ahead and let's read Joshua. I have all of Joshua 5, but for today, we're going to cover 1 through 12. So what I'd like to do, Joe, if you would, start off, and if everyone would take a verse as we go around, that would be great.
All right. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel.
At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the sons of Israel a second time."
So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haaraloth.
Number 4.
It's after 3.
Yeah, that's what
Wow.
All the people that came out of Egypt. Does it say
4.
Yeah. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt were males. All the men of war had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt.
Those who left Egypt had all been circumcised, but none of those born after the Exodus during the years in the wilderness had been circumcised.
Okay, I'm doing Romans 8.
Joshua. We aren't doing these yet. Done.
The Israelites had traveled in the wilderness for 40 years until all the men who were old enough to fight in battle when they left Egypt died. For they had disobeyed the Lord, and the Lord vowed he would not let them enter the land he had sworn to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey.
So it was their children whom he raised up in their place that Joshua circumcised. For they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way.
When the circumcision of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed.
The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day.
While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho.
And on the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain.
And the men ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land, and there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year.
Okay, so thank you for everyone who played in my little game there. When we think of this book, when we think of Joshua, and especially this chapter, there's a famous book out there, and unfortunately Ray's not here. I was going to pick on Ray a little bit, but Rick may remember this one. The Art of War. Has anyone ever heard of that book before? The Art of War. Yes. Okay. It is a very famous Now, it's a very famous book in military tactics, okay? It was written about 5 to 3 BC century, somewhere in that range, okay? And it basically told everyone what it meant to go into combat, okay? It's important to remember that because that's man's version of how to go into combat. It's not God's version, okay? Joshua 5 is God's version, okay? It's a very strong point. Some people even have nicknamed it, the author that we are, Dobson, who we are kind of following for this book, has even said that one may attach the art of war to this chapter. And the reason why is because in this chapter, they just crossed over, right, the River Jordan, and they're right in front of Jericho, right? Okay? So, it's the first battle that can happen in Canaan. Okay? They're encamped in front of everyone. If Joshua would have gone by what the art of war would have said, he would have said, when we are near, make the enemy believe we are far, and when we are far, make the enemy believe we are close. However, you couldn't do that. You really couldn't, because they were in plain sight. Which breaks another rule, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You know, there's a lot of rules out of that book that were broken by Joshua, but we got to remember, God's in control. Okay? Also in the book, it talks about don't go up against a walled city. Why would you want to do that? You know? Don't give your position away. Don't be out in plain daylight. And with that, Joshua had 2 strikes against them. You know, as humans, we think, oh my goodness, that's the worst thing we could do. But thankfully, God's ways are not man's ways. So it's a great thing to remember that our thoughts that we think are great may actually be folly, and the foolish, quote unquote, that people would say of God's ways really are the best ways on the face of earth. And there's a cross-reference that if you look up Isaiah 55, will someone look up Isaiah 55, 8 through 9 for me, please?
I got that.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
And if that doesn't cement it for you, you could look up in 1 Corinthians 1:25. The fact that they were not ready for battle on the way that the Art of War book said to be, had nothing to do with marshaling the troops or getting them ready or planning or anything like that, or doing any practice maneuvers. It was because the Lord had to prepare them spiritually. We talked about before how after they came out of Egypt, they were not circumcised, and that was not just of the body, but of the spirit as well. Okay? They were within striking distance of Jericho. They were right there. But because they were not ready, they had to first circumcise the soldiers and celebrate the Passover. What is that a form of? This may be a little bit of a stretch because I know the answer, so if I'm saying it confusing, I apologize.
Sacraments?
Sacraments. And what is sacraments? A form of worship. Thank you. Form of worship. Okay? So, they had to worship, and worship comes before war. Okay? If you think about it, when we worship, it prepares us to be more focused on God. It prepares us for that battle. It prepares us for the warfare. In the very beginning of this chapter, it opens by describing the setting of worship. Later, it talks about two further scenes narrate the acts of worship, which are the circumcision and celebration of Passover. And third, we'll talk a little bit here in the delay of worship. As we talked about, chapter 5 begins with a comment which forms a bridge from previous chapters to this one. It talks about how they just crossed the river and how God had made it dry so that they could pass over. The Canaanite leaders were quaking because of what God had done. What God, think about it. You were there all happy in your little land, and you know the Israelites are on the other side. Your enemy is on the other side of the river. The river will help us. They don't have boats to get over. They don't have submarines like some of us like. And we're good. We have nothing to think about. All of a sudden, the Jordan is dried up. People were able to cross over. And it's not small amounts of people. Like Pastor Bob talked about last week, think about the number of people in Pinellas County. He used that as the example of it. Okay, that's a lot of people. I don't know about you, but in my travels, this area is actually a little bit more congested than some other areas. So imagine all those people all of a sudden plopping right next to you. Be a little bit nerve-wracking in my opinion, you know? But if you think about it, it kind of goes back to the way that the Israelites were when they heard about the land of the giants. And that's in Deuteronomy 1:28. Can someone read that, please? Anyone?
I got it here, 128.
Yes.
Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there.
So, with that, that's the way that the Canaanites felt right now. Because they were like, oh my goodness, all these people have come over. What are we to do? The fear was so great that they stayed in the city of Jericho, even though the Israelites were camped right outside of the city. And that fear kept them in. And it's kind of cool if you think about it. In a way, it's kind of psychological warfare. Because now God can prepare his people, because the people of Jericho are so afraid they don't come out. So that gives the time for Passover to be done and circumcisions to be done.
And that's the same description in Joshua 2.
That's correct.
Rahab says, we saw what the Lord has done and our hearts melted.
That is correct. That is in Joshua 2, verse 11. Very good. I think I have that up here somewhere. Yes, right there.
There it is.
Okay? So, yes, that is correct. Okay. Okay, so Lord's rescue from the water of Jordan is salvation. And salvation leads to worship, as it always should. Okay? Any questions so far?
Just the food.
We'll get to the food.
Follow up on the food. If the produce of the land, how long have they been there? Long enough to grow something?
No.
No, the people who
No.
occupied the land previously had grown
Yes.
vines and fruit trees, and they came in and defeated them and took their produce.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that along the way. Okay, so the one big takeaway that I do want you guys to really take away out of this is worship is a key component in growth. Remember, go to the other building.
Say that again, Nancy. Go to.
What?
What was your last statement?
My last statement is worship is a key component in growth. Okay? If you are not spending that time in worship, you aren't going to grow. Okay? So, we kind of hinted on this a little bit, and people kind of helped out. Let's ask the question again. What kind of worship did Israel conduct? This is kind of a repeat.
Circumcision.
Okay, that's one. What was the other one?
Passover.
Yes, Passover. Yes, Rick, you... Okay, so...
I'm trolling you back.
The first ritual that they observed was circumcision. Now, this was something that God had given as a sign of his covenant to Abraham. And that's referred to in Genesis 17, 9 through 14. And this symbolizes the removing of the flesh and a rebirth of spiritualness. And you can look at that as far as that's concerned in Deuteronomy 10, 16, and Jeremiah 4:4. In the beginning, as we were reading through, the Lord commanded Joshua to make flint knives and circumcise the son of Israel for the second time. That was in verse 2, if you remember our reading. If I remember right, Joshua read that. And for the second time. Why is the second time?
The second time what?
For the circumcision. Why is it the second? How can you be circumcised twice?
Heart.
Okay. Is it just that?
Well, yeah, there was a whole generation of people who grew up in the land of Egypt who had not been circumcised.
That is correct. Okay? The fathers were circumcised, but the sons, the next generation was never. And because of that, we'll find out a little bit later that their disobedience actually led to this situation that they were in. Okay? The explanation actually appears a little bit later in verse 5, and it said that the current generation had not been. Okay? So, why had it not been done before? If we look in verses 4 through 7, though the men who came out of Egypt had been, they neglected to do the same for their sons. And because of this rebellion, the generation perished in the wilderness. Okay? They did not believe that God was able to defeat the Canaanites. And for that reason, they were fearful and refused to enter the land. So they didn't even make an attempt because they were so afraid. Okay? And unfortunately, and if you think about it, it happens today, if we're disobedient and we like want to do our own thing, we tend to have the problem of not enjoying the blessings, just like they didn't enjoy the blessings of the promised land. We have the same issue. Their decision, their disobedience, kept them from performing their duties for their sons like God had asked them to do. When the men came out of Egypt, they had the signs. Okay? They had the signs that they were able to, that they were circumcised and they did the right things, quote unquote. But did they? No. Just because you have the signs of, I can go through the motions. I can come here every Sunday morning. I can come here every Wednesday night. I can do, quote unquote, all the right things. However, it is, if I don't have Christ and I don't have the right motive, and there's the rules that we have there are just a way for us to know what our sins are. It needs to be the love of Christ that changes us.
Romans 8:3. For God has done the law weakened by the flesh, could not be sending his own Son, likeness of flesh, for sin to condemn the sin of the flesh.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So it is possible to possess the sign and seal of the covenant and do the kind of things Christians are expected to do, but yet remain in spiritual darkness. The wilderness generation had failed in their spiritual duties to children, their children. This is a sobering thought. The one thing that I love is my wife has a saying up on her mirror that says, "We can't mess up God's will." And that's awesome, because I know I screwed up. My kids will be probably the first ones to tell you that I messed up somehow, you know, and rightfully so, I did, you know. Growing them up, we made mistakes, but it's because of God's will and God's work in their life that they are the way they are right now. So, but what that has to do to us is that has to drive us to the foot of the cross. That has to drive us to our knees and ask for forgiveness. Because we do not do God's will in everything we're supposed to do. And as a man, that's hard to admit. It really is. But we have to. We have to ask for forgiveness. So, Joshua finished their circumcisions, and they stayed in camp for a while. If you can imagine, there was a healing process to this. And it's not one of those 1 days or 2 days type of deals. And they talk about that in verse 8, about how they stayed, did not proceed any further until they were healed. And we know from past experiences with Shechem, when he wanted to marry Jacob's daughter, the sons of Jacob had put on that stipulation that he, along with his fathers and the men of the city, had to all be circumcised. And they did. But even after 3 days, they were still sore to where they could not defend themselves against the attack of Simeon and Levi, right? Right? Okay. So, and if you want to read more about that, that comes up in Genesis 34. Okay? Any questions so far? The most significant outcome of this event was not just that it applied the sign of the covenant who were denied it before, but it also prepared them for battle. It also prepared them for battle. Okay? One of the bad things about this was there was a lot of shame and reproach on it because the generation had not been with God like they should have. There was a lot of God can't do this type of thing. And so that weighs hard on us. And it's a powerful tool against you keeping with what you're supposed to do. You know, we have misdeeds, mistreatments, harsh words that make us feel like they did, where they were quote unquote useless. But remember, the gospel rolls that guilt and shame away. Okay? Get into the Word. As a believer, you can overcome the disgrace of sin by refusing to identify with your old life outside of Christ. And how do you do that? You come closer, the gospel. Okay? If you labor under the weight of shame and guilt and disgrace, let the place where you become, let that be your place of guile. Turn your heart to Christ and say, Lord, let me see myself in you. Roll away the shame I feel, and no longer let sin and failure be the defining features on the way I see my life, on the way anyone else sees it. Since I am in Christ, let my life reflect the glory of your grace, and let my heart rejoice in the assurance of sins forgiven. Very powerful. Very powerful. Okay? Let's talk about what happened after the circumcision. What was the second part of worship for them? Anyone?
Passover.
Passover, thank you. Okay? And we talked last week in reference how they prepared it on the 10th day of the month. And as we read, we heard that it was in the 14th day. Okay? In verses 10 through 12, it gives a little bit, and it's a small version of what the celebration was like, and talking also a little bit about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. First, verse 10 points out the timing. Speaking of time, how am I doing? Okay, good. The celebration took place on the dates prescribed. Can anyone remember a couple of verses where God prescribed a certain time period?
Obviously, when he gave him the Passover.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, in Exodus 12:6, it talks about the timing of it. It also talks about it in Numbers 9:5, are some of the areas that it talks about it. Okay? Also, it talks about the groundwork back in the last chapter, verse 19. 4:19, it had talked about the preparation of it. The significance becomes clear when you realize that the 10th day of the first month was the day that the Israelites chose their Passover lamb. And that actually, I had said 12:6. You could actually read 12:3 through 6. because it talks about the 10th day and it continues on. Okay? Israel kept the Passover on the plains of Jericho. Camped out. It would be like, this would be the city of Jericho, and the playground right out there could be where we were celebrating Passover. It was in plain sight. Okay? Which is pretty amazing itself, because I don't know about you, if I had that city there and I was over there, I'd still be a little distracted probably, you know, by the big city over there. But it's cool to know that they were able to focus on worship and focus on the Passover. Okay, why is the Passover so important? The Passover was the Old Testament's parallel to the Lord's Supper. It is a sacrificial meal, and the celebration involved slaying a lamb. The Lord's Supper is not a sacrificial meal. It's more of a meal of remembrance and looking back at the sacrifice. Okay? And places we can find that is in John 1:29, Revelations 5:9 and 12, and Revelations 13 and 8, verse 8.
And Neil, can I make a comment on that?
Yes.
The Passover, we were talking about preparing them for battle. The Passover reminds them of what happened in Egypt, where they did not have to do anything. They put the blood on the doorposts, and God had the victory. And just as they're going in to the battle with Jericho.
Yes, you are correct.
Yes, they're just got to march around the city. Just
yes.
Follow what God does. He's going to do everything.
But we haven't gotten quite that far yet.
It's a reminder of
yes.
that.
Yes, we haven't gotten that far yet. You're cheating ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, but you are correct. The Passover symbolizes that it was God who did everything. He protected the people. And it's just like in the future, we'll see. But I'm not going to let that cat out of the bag, even though we all know what happens. Okay, so remember, Christ was our Passover lamb that was sacrificed. And that comes in 1 Corinthians 5:7. Remember, we don't literally eat Christ's body or drink his blood, but the bread and the cup we receive by faith the benefits of the Savior's life and death. Okay? In the Westminster Larger Catechism, question number 170, and I won't put anyone on the spot to ask what that question is, how do they that worthily communicate in the Lord's Supper feed upon the body and the blood of Christ therein? The answer, as the body and the blood of Christ are not corporately or carnally present in, with, or under the bread and the wine in the Lord's Supper, and yet are spiritually present to the faith of the receiver, no less truly and really than the elements themselves are to their outward senses, so they that worthily communicate in the sacraments of the Lord's Supper do therein feed upon the body and the blood of Christ, not after corporate or carnal, but in the spiritual manner, yet truly and really, well by faith they receive and apply unto themselves Christ's crucifixion and all the benefits of his death. I apologize, I get a little tongue-tied when I'm trying to read a little bit. So, Israel's celebration of Passover was also an expression of faith and means of assurance, just like what we have each worship day, each time we worship. By sitting on the plains of Jericho, having just crossed the Jordan on not wet ground, but dry ground. Okay? The Passover reminded the people that the same God who brought them out of Egypt would certainly bring them into full possession of Canaan. The Lord's Supper should work the same way for Christians. We should use the elements to remind us of Jesus' life and death. We should cling to the promise that he died and rose again for our salvation and will bring us to heaven. The person who is best suited for engagement in spiritual warfare is the one who knows he or she fights in the victory Jesus has already won. The battle's been won. Thankfully, because I would lose. I don't know about anyone else, but I would, if it wasn't for Christ. Okay? As we are running a little bit up on time, there's a couple more things we want to talk about. We want to talk about the manna. Do you remember the manna? What was the manna? Food, okay? When did the manna appear?
While they're sleeping.
Okay? It appeared every day but the Sabbath day, right? Right? Because the day before they collected enough for the Sabbath as well, right? Okay, so I don't know if anyone remembers, but they had a celebration of that. And they were basically reminded about how God was providing for them. They didn't need the manna anymore, right? Because they had the food from the land that they were currently at. Okay? But it was because God provided for them. And we need to realize that God provides for us. And if you want to learn more about it, you can look in Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. Okay? Also, you can look in John 6, 30 to 31 as well. And also in John 6, 32 through 35. And it talks about the comparison when Christ talks about the fact that that manna was given by my Father, he says, and that he was providing for you. Okay? Any questions so far? Any comments so far? Okay. Let's talk about the final piece. We talked earlier about the setting. We talked about the fact of worship. And now we're going to talk about the delay of worship. Okay? Waiting on the Lord. Okay? We look at the text in some detail. We need to take a step back now and look at the big picture. Circumcision and Passover carried a big, significant theological weight and spiritual lessons in of themselves. God designed them that way. He placed the two events in the book of Joshua on the brink of conquest for a reason. Before Israel could fight against their enemies, they first must worship God. We do not learn to fight spiritual battles by studying the book of Art of War. We don't. Okay? We do it by coming to God, to worshiping God. Okay? If you think about it, everything that they did was foolish to man. Setting themselves up in front of their enemy, wanting to go against the city and staying there, just kind of encouraging the enemy to come out. But thankfully, also, the other point was they weakened themselves before battle. Right? Thankfully, it's a great thing. God's ways are not foolish. Okay? They took their time, the Israelites took their time to prepare the Passover, to prepare for worship. They prepared the unleavened bread. The plotting and planning, like the book Art of War would have told them to do, was not their priority. Their priority was worshiping God. The Lord stresses this principle of worship first in the very way that our week is designed. When Jesus rose from the dead, it changed the Sabbath from the last day to the first day of the week. And we now call it the Lord's Day. And the cross-reference for that is Revelations 1, verse 10. By placing his day as the first day of the week, God calls us to worship him and rest our bodies to prepare us for what lies ahead in the next 6 days. Those who wait on the Lord receive his strength to do his will. Can someone read Isaiah 40, 29 through 31, please? Anyone? It is Isaiah 40, 29 through 31.
He gives power to the weak and strength to the powerless. Even youths will become weak and tired, and young men will fall in exhaustion. But those who trust in the Lord will find new strength. They will soar high on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint.
We must start our task from a position of calmness, of rest, and worship. Didn't the psalmist write, "Be still and know that I am your God"? And that was in Psalms 46. What verse? 46:10, actually, I think, if my notes are correct. Isaiah reminds us, "For thus says the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in return and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." And that's in Isaiah 30:15. Remember, this part of chapter 5 is the right approach to the art of spiritual warfare. Okay, remember, it's not the art of war that we talked about, but it's the art of spiritual warfare.
We're after.
In quietness and rest, we find our strength. In worship, we find our souls fortified for the battle that lies ahead. Mr. Nick, will you please close us in prayer?
Father God in heaven, we ask you to prepare our hearts for worship this morning. We thank you for these words in Joshua that remind us that worship is how we get prepared for the battle this week that we have within us and out in the world. We ask you, Father, that you prepare us for that as we worship you today. Amen.
Amen.